anything you'd like to talk through, please post there. Otherwise, I believe we have a couple of topics around our intake forms that we're seeing some questions on, just with troubleshooting and also just some best practices there. So we can dive in, and then if we see any questions come through Q&A, we can pivot to that. One thing, if you guys haven't already, best practice, we do always recommend just expanding this dashboard screen as you're getting used to this system so you can quickly see your different menus in your account. Again, today we're going to start out with some intake form strategies. So under your hammer icon, you'll see your templates, and that will take you to your template editor, where we should see intake forms right around the middle. Now, with most plans as we're moving forward, you guys should have up to 4 intake forms now on the premium plan and up. So you guys actually have a lot of flexibility in here to create some different forms based on the different types of deals you're tracking. So with this, we're going to take a look at the buyer residential contract today and just talk through some best practices here. It is a little bit different. If you're not used to intake forms, you may not know as much of just the navigation and also best practices. So starting out here, our fields tab, the number one rule with the fields tab is we're only going to select fields here that we want to see every single time on our intake form and on our property record. So with this view, you should see a couple of different tabs up top. I'm actually in a demo account, so we have quite a few, but these are called your field groups. So you can toggle through these. Normally we see up to 1 to 4, I feel like is the average field groups in an account. Again, we have a little bit of cleanup to do here. You can toggle through these different field groups to find the fields in the account that you want to, again, see on that intake form every single time. And Hannah, please feel free to jump in here as well, just with some strategies of what you're finding. But one thing that we see oftentimes with selecting the fields that you're going to see on the front end of your intake form, that is this left column here. Whether your agents are filling it out or you yourself as the admin is filling this out, this controls what you see on the front end of the intake as you are completing it. The right-hand column is going to be what you see on your property record once that intake form has been submitted. When we're selecting fields here, the first column you're going to see is green. That means that this field is going to be available. You'll be able to fill that out on the intake form. We select our red button. That means that this field is then going to be required to fill out on the intake form. You cannot move forward until this has been updated. If I ever needed to deselect these, if I come in and deselect green first, you will see that this red just disappears. It's not necessarily best practice. What I would recommend doing, as you can see what I just did, we don't want to have just red selected. Generally green first, then you can select red, deselect red first, then deselect green. Same concept here on the right-hand side. This is going to show what is on your property here with this green icon or checkbox. And then our red icon is going to tell us that this field is internally required. I think this is probably a good strategy question to talk through, Hannah, if you have any points as well. But when do we want internally required fields? We see this a lot, and it's kind of up to you and your team dynamic. If your agents are going to be filling out that form and then your TMs are processing the file, it's nice for that TM to have additional fields that they get to fill out when they're approving the intake form. If you're the one who's going to be filling out the intake form and processing the transaction in open to close, you're likely not going to want to have as many internally required fields because you can just add them all to the front end since you're doing it yourself.
Yeah, I think that's perfect.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would add as well is if you select anything on the left-hand column, any of those fields for the agent to fill out, you'll also want to make sure that you select them on the right-hand column as well. That's saying we want to ask that question on the intake form or we want to have that field filled out. And we also want to bring it into that transaction. That way you guys can review that information. If you only have the left-hand side selected and not the corresponding right-hand side, it's not going to know to bring in that field. You haven't told it that we need that field. That's the only thing I would add.
Yeah, that's good.
Trying to think. That's really it.
The other question we see come up with this too is, how do I get internally required fields on my property that are conditional? I don't need them every time. Again, this fields tab is only for the fields that we want every single time. That's where your form conditions and your form triggers are going to be really powerful. So we'll touch on that here in a minute, but again, please post any questions you guys are seeing yourself, especially with intake forms while we're here in that Q&A, so we can dig a little bit deeper. But another thing that can be very powerful is just some instructions. Whether or not, again, you're filling this out yourself or your agents are, you do have some page text at the top of each of your pages here where you can put in some details on what you're asking your users to do. So very custom, you guys can have that be whatever you would like. In this case, we don't have anything there, but for the most part, that is going to be your fields tab. Moving on to documents. We've had a couple of questions come in here with, how do I manage my folders that come through from my intake form? This again is very custom. There's certain instances where I may need to require more documents on my intake form than others, but for the most part, we generally recommend having a folder for just contract documents in general. That could be your contract to buy and sell, that could be your disclosures and addendums. You could drop them all into this one folder, so that way when that transaction coordinator is coming through and approving the intake, they can then assign the appropriate file roles. We do have the option for an additional folder if needed, but we don't necessarily break down our folders on the intake form to each type of document that we're going to have our agents fill out. That's a lot of, again, what our TCs potentially are doing as part of their job is actually managing the documents for that transaction. However, you can come in and add additional documents here. Again, these are going to be more like folders in the system. We can preset some file roles, but most oftentimes you guys are going to be setting those file roles once the documents come through. Are you seeing anything else here, Hannah, with how implementation is working through this?
Yeah, the only other thing I've seen is that, let's say you don't want them to upload it here, and instead you're going to make that connection afterwards, right? You're going to make that connection to Dotloop, and you're going to bring in the documents from Dotloop, or you're going to import the documents from SkySlope. You don't have to have documents required here. That little switch next to generate documents on the page on the intake form, right above, it's that green switch. We turn that off. That's it. No documents are required. So just keep that in mind, that if you are going to use that integration, you are going to bring them in, through that integration. You technically don't need to require the documents. We usually suggest it because it makes it easier, and then your TC doesn't have to worry about that. They can go through and pull up that contract right away. But yeah, just want to make sure you guys know that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful too. If you're a Dotloop user consistently, you can pull those documents from that Dotloop record, since those contracts were created there, saving you and your agent some time. So that's a really good nugget. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next, we have our contacts page. So this we do see, again, very custom. It's kind of dependent on who you work with in your area. So with this contacts page, generally, I am going to likely have, we may see this somewhat different in each of your accounts, but we like to have a separate intake form for the buyer deals versus the seller deals. And the reason for that is it allows us to manage our form triggers a little bit better. Troubleshooting is a lot easier because we can tie things back to a specific intake form for what's going on. So I know that this is a buyer's intake form, so I'm going to be asking for buyer contact information. With this, again, I can add in additional contact roles here with my dropdown. I can also designate if this contact is going to be required when I'm filling out that intake form. Best practice is don't require a contact that you don't know when you first get your file. So a good example of that may be our home inspector. If you still need to send out recommendations for who these buyers are going to choose for the home inspection, we may not know who they've chosen at the time of filling this out. We could instead, my favorite merge fields, if your agents are filling out the intake form, you could put in a contact role for who the agent wants to recommend for their home inspector. So they could put anywhere from 2 to 5, etc., different contacts into this contact role. And then the TC knows who to send out for recommendations when they are sending their intro emails to the buyers. So really think about who you know you're working with when you first get your file, who you want to kick things off in those first couple of steps. Otherwise, if it's someone you're going to work with later in the transaction, we can always create that reminder in your processes to add them to your property once the intake is complete. Otherwise, similar with Documents tab, as Hannah was showing, we do have the option to say, no, we don't need this contacts page. If that's the case, we just toggle to beige, green,
yep.
not green.
From green to white.
So with this, the next tab we see is just our review page. And so best practice, pop in a little advisory for whoever is going to be completing this intake form to let them know that they should double check this information because it's going to power the rest of your processes. Otherwise, the final page we have here is our submitted page. You can make those custom touches as needed. But just going to pause really quick if you guys do have any questions on this. If you have not gotten to this part of your build out yet, it does take some time, and we generally recommend working on your intake forms after you have gone through and updated your task templates, your document templates, date templates, etc. Just that way you don't have to keep going back and forth in your build. It does look like we have a question coming through. Thank you, Sarah. If a particular document is a required part of the intake form, should that document be removed from the document template applied to the transaction? We're just starting to use OTC, and I notice I have duplicate documents showing up in my transactions, and I'm wondering if that's why. Great question.
Ooh, yeah.
Really great question. So with this, if I'm hearing correctly, there are some instances when I am approving and uploading my documents where I may see duplicate placeholders. And a lot of that is due to how we assign those documents when we're uploading them. So potentially when we're first setting up here our folders, again, I could upload one document to this folder when I'm filling out the intake form. I could upload multiple documents at that time. So what would happen when that intake form is complete, a part of your approval process will be a prompt to come in here, and I don't think I'm going to be able to do it. Let me send a quick email to this. Will be to approve that document and assign a placeholder. Let me see if I have another one.
I think my other follow-up question would be, we have to think, do we want to have that document, that fully executed document, uploaded during the intake process, or do we want to file it away after it's already been submitted? Some of you guys might have it where you have all those documents, you want to put it in right when you fill out that intake form. And so we need to file it right away. You know, it has its file role. We know where it's going, type of thing. And some of you might go, you just send them all to me. We'll take care of it afterwards, if that makes sense. It just kind of depends. I think in your case, Sarah, I believe you guys have those specific documents already filled out. So we might want to remove those specific documents that you already have filled out from the document template. The only thing is if they don't upload those documents, technically, if they don't upload those documents, then you don't have that in your document template. So it just kind of depends. It's difficult to provide guidance when there's so much different sort of functionality you can do with it.
Yeah, let me see if I can get this. It may take a minute.
Yeah, usually it sends an email and says like it's been received, I think, typically.
Yeah. So once we get that document come through, we'll show you what we're seeing here, Sarah, with all this. It looks like it just did. Okay, so here's document prompt. Let me pop over to our record here. But when we're approving those documents, whether it's through the intake form or throughout the transaction, if you already have your placeholder set in those document templates, like Hannah's saying here, I don't necessarily want to create a new line item. So by default, I choose placeholder because placeholder means that I can then go find the folder that this placeholder lives in and then the line item it belongs to. And by choosing it here, that's then going to hit approve, move it to that line item without creating an additional placeholder. So that's the most common reason I see myself creating duplicates when I'm in the system, is because I'm just assigning a new folder and file role. So if you see that option for placeholder, default to choose that. Again, whether it's when you're first approving those intakes or as you're processing your transaction.
The other thing I might add for this as well is that, so let's say you have this list of documents that are going to come in right when you approve that intake form, and you look over the documents, and whoever uploaded those documents, whether they be an agent, TC, they did upload them correctly, but we want to file them away, just like Jana did. She chose a placeholder, she put it in the correct area. What she has highlighted right now, unapproved documents are finished, remove empty intake folders. This is what we would want to select. So what we would do is we would put them in their proper placeholder. You've confirmed that that's the correct document, and then remove any excess intake folders. So it could be right now what you're doing is you're saying, I'm approving the document. It's good to stay where it is, but we actually want to move it out of the intake, right? Out of that intake folder and put it into the actual folder that it needs to be in. So if she selects remove that intake folder, it'll say, what do you want to remove? If it's empty, then there isn't going to be any. If you select hide, it will hide itself until another document comes in. So that's another way that we can kind of think about this. When you have those documents come in, do we want it to where it says, contract intake, and I have to split up the documents and put them away? Or do I have them uploaded into their specific file roles, and then I just have to file them away again once I've gotten that document, or, once I've gotten that intake form in? That's good.
Great question there. Thank you.
Let us know if there's a follow-up to that. Yeah. All right.
It does look like we have another question in here. Who can submit an intake form? What role should be assigned to them? Great question there. So with your intake forms, you have two options for that. Either agent portal users. Again, those are non-paid user seats. If you guys haven't reviewed those options there, it's really powerful for still incorporating your agents into the system in your process, but they're not considered an actual team member, a paid user seat. So agent portal users, depending on what access we've given them, will have the option to fill out intake form. So we have the ability to come in and say, for Raymond here, they're going to have access to both the buyer and seller intake form, and potentially my other agent, Test here, is only taking on buyer transactions at this time, so they just have access to the buyer residential intake form. So agents with portal access can fill out those intake forms. Otherwise, your internal users will have access to fill out intake forms. And I believe that's also based on the permissions we set for those additional users. So your organization and user settings, I've toggled very quickly there. Let me backtrack. Under our gear icon, we have organization and users, which is where we can see all of our team members, our agents. We can update those permissions as necessary, and also invite additional agent portal users and team members. So with our permissions for team members, we do have the option to control their navigation menu, where they can see intake submissions, etc. Our data segments, properties, contacts, imports, tags, marketplace, and admin. So depending on the permissions you set for your team, they may or may not have access to those areas of the platform. But generally, as you guys are getting started, it's always a great question to ask of, how do you normally kick things off for your files right now? Do your agents just send you that contract and say, I have a new file, can you start the process? Or do they already have an intake type form that they're filling out to let you know that you have a new file? It really is a preference of how you want to work with your team and the agents that you represent. So we do see it a lot of different ways. I think having the agents fill out the intake form is great because it helps them really just be aware of what this new file looks like, and also confirm some details that you may not be able to know by just looking at a file. Again, it kind of depends on that working relationship, but if you have an agent that, maybe does a special offer where they help out with, I don't know, like a closing gift, they decided to pay for the buyer's inspections. I don't know, could be something custom. Having that intake form can be really helpful because they can make those additional notes for you when you first get that file. So I do like to see agents filling it out, but we do also see a lot of admins, transaction coordinators doing that as well. Hope that helps. Let us know if you have any follow-ups with that. Hannah, do you have any additional points with what you're seeing on your side?
I think that this is actually a perfect time to segue back into the intake form and talk about the settings. I'd like to touch on the settings before we get into automation, just because I think that that's really powerful. So underneath settings, we have settings. So this is where you're setting up that settings, but the assigned agents is what I was actually thinking about starting with. Yeah. So if you noticed, when you go to that agent, you can also say, this is who they, this who needs access to the intake form. But here you can also search for the agent. So if you've invited all of your agents and you don't want to have to go to the organization users, locate the agent, click on them, go in there. And if you notice, you have to click onto it, and then add them in. Instead, you can go directly to that intake form and say, okay, I need to find Raymond. Let me search for him. Let me enter him. And then let me fill out the different information. And I think that going through this is going to be really helpful for a lot of you, because I've heard a lot of you go, Hannah, they can't submit it. They don't have access to it. We need to make sure we select everything in red. So Gianna right now, she's going to select the team. You can have my team, you can have buyer team, you can have seller team, whatever makes sense to you guys and what your process is. You can even have it down to like different cities or counties, whatever it makes sense. You're going to want to choose the team user. Now you can change the team user in the future. I know that some of you guys do it where you have one person who's making sure to manage the beginning part of the transaction, and then it changes later. We can talk about whether or not we're going to continue with that person as the assigned team user or switch it up, but this is where you'd set that. You can add in that brokerage if you want to add in that brokerage, and then always choose the time zone. That's so that we can make sure that we don't have a brokerage in here yet. We always want to choose the time zone for sure, though, because the time zone is going to really help us set. We want to make sure that this is going out the right time. Jana is in Mountain Time. I am in Pacific Standard Time. So if I was working with her, she was managing my transactions in California, I would want to make sure that she put California. That way she's getting the correct times and the dates for everything that needs to get done. So just keep that in mind. This is really what I wanted to show, especially for submitting the intake form. But I mean, if you want, Jana, we could just keep going down this list, internal instructions, layout, default design, if you want, and then jump up to automations. What do you think that would be a good idea?
Yes.
Awesome.
Internal instructions will tie into form conditions as well, because we can create some conditional internal instructions. Mm-hmm. But this is going to be a prompt that you get when you're approving that intake form in the system. So again, when the approval is happening, you'll be prompted to check each of these instructions off. So one thing that we do see quite a bit of is just how do I put in a reminder for my team to set up the integrations for my new property? I strongly like putting those into internal instructions. That way I know before I ever even start completing my tasks, I know for me, I need to connect my property to sky slopes. That way I can then use that for compliance. Mm-hmm. So these are very custom as well. This is going to be something, again, you're held accountable to as you're completing that approval process. So if it's something that may take you a day to complete, don't put it here. That's what your tasks are for. This is something that should be quick. You'd be able to do within that. Likely it's like a 10, 20-minute window for your approval process, depending on how much you build in there. You do have, like we were saying, the ability to create conditional instructions as well. So hypothetically, we have a property where I need to come in and confirm trying to think of a good example here of that one.
Yeah.
I think it would be like a referral potentially, where I want to make sure that I have some referral details or go track those down. As I'm getting things kicked off in my file, I can include internal instructions in my form conditions to only say I need this instruction if there is a referral for this property. Otherwise, if you need to edit existing instructions, it's just a type in field. I would just default hit enter on that, but we do have a little trash can icon if we need to remove those instructions, and you do have a drag and drop tool here as well. Otherwise, settings, this is something that, like Hannah was touching on, you can set default settings for your intake forms. That way, when you are reviewing your property record and you're prompted to update your defaults and settings, some of these can be preset. So if you're only handling transactions in one area, for example, I may preset this time zone, so that way I know every time it's defaulting to Mountain. I believe if you change that based on your assigned agents, it's going to default to the time zone there instead.
Yes.
And then date calculations. This one, if you leave NA, you will be prompted to do this as you're approving that intake form. So that way you have the control to preset these for every file. Sometimes in certain states, you can actually write into your contract, or maybe you have different types of contracts by county or area, and they use days or business days fields versus calendar days. So if that's the case where you could have either or scenario, default to NA. So that way you can preset this on the property when you first get your file to get better control. Otherwise, if it's always going to use business days, always going to use calendar days, you can preset that here. Same with skip federal holidays and your weekend federal holiday roll. This is going to apply to any dates that are not built into your date templates as well. So just kind of keep that in mind. If you have different date calculations, you can create that in your date templates. That way, those kind of supersede, I guess, is the best way to explain that.
Yeah.
What we preset here. Any additional thoughts on that?
No, I think that's perfect. I just want to make sure that everyone knows, like you definitely want to, if you don't want to have to deal with that screen popping up and saying, set your default, settings for each intake form, definitely feel free to set it here. And then if you guys find later on, Hannah, we don't need business days for this. We want calendar days. It's just a matter of going to that property and updating those set default fields. You can always update the fields. You can always update the settings for them for each transaction.
Yeah. That's good. Next, we have layout. I do think we'll want to circle back to this as we get into form conditions.
Definitely, yeah.
Layout can be really impactful of how your form conditions work on the front end of your intake form and just the order of how you're filling things out. So kind of rule of thumb, if you're using any form conditions to add or remove fields, those should be below the fields that we're using in those conditions. So I think best example we can give is we have transaction details, our property questions, contract questions that we've used in our form conditions to pull in our appropriate deadlines. So we want to make sure that our critical deadlines are below those questions, so I don't have to keep scrolling back and forth in my intake form. So this layout here will control the front end layout here. So again, we have our address details up top. We do like to keep those bunched together by our contract title for a full address. So that way you know that those merge fields populate correctly. From there, we have some of our questions that we'd be asking, and these are the questions that we have conditions on. So if I say, no, we did not waive that finance contingency, I need to pull in my days field, so that way I can enter in that deadline for this contingency. So pretty powerful, but if I had this critical deadlines up top, after I answer these questions, it's a lot of scrolling. So layout can be very, very time saving for you guys. This is going to be based on the field sections that are in your field editor. Oh, looked like we had a question come through, but disappeared.
Sorry, it was just a question asking, I'm new to open to close. I haven't officially started yet, but none of this makes sense. Is it being recorded? We are being recorded. And we do have a place where these will live. I'm going to see if I can get the link to where it is in the help center, the Wednesday workshops.
Perfect. Yeah, this is, again, one of the more advanced topics that we see users getting into. So absorb what you can. We can circle back to these in future Wednesday workshops. Also, Definitely. We're just somewhat filling time until more questions come into Q&A. So if you have other questions on the system, please feel free to pop those in as well.
Yeah, especially new questions too, Derek. If you have anything where you're like, how would I do this? Or how would I do this? Just brainstorming ideas. This is a really good time to ask those, and you can kind of hear from us, like, these are the different ways you could handle it. That way, when you do get started, you can always refer back to it. I'm sending you the link in a reply to the other Wednesday workshops that we have.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannah.
Yeah, no worries.
So again, we'll circle back to layout likely here in a minute once we get into more of those form conditions. The last tab in our settings is going to be default design. So you guys can set the default for the entire intake form. That's great for branding. So that way you guys have your team colors in there. You can upload your logo and image, but you can also have your default branding for your brokerages as well. So if you're working with multiple different agents, and they're a part of different brokerages or different teams, you can come in, create those brokerages, put in those branding and themes, and then assign that to the agent user. So that way this particular agent would see their branding and theme when they go to fill out that intake form. So it does give you a lot of control there. But the next thing, and probably the most involved part of the intake form, is going to be your form conditions and form triggers.
Yep.
So popping in here, please ask questions, guys. If you have any examples of what you're trying to build in your account, we can talk through how we may approach that. But form
maybe
conditions,
even show how to build it. So yeah, definitely ask.
But this allows us to pull out additional information on the intake form as we fill it out. So kind of like we saw here, if I want to say, if I'm not waiving that survey requirement, I want to pull in when the survey date is due. That is going to be done with our form conditions. So kind of think about what questions you'd be asking yourself or your team when you get a new file, and what types of information are you going to base your processes off of. Most of the form conditions we see here are also going to be the same condition logic that we use for form triggers to pull in our task templates, our document templates, our field sections, etc. Most oftentimes, these form conditions relate to the type of property that the sale relates to, and then also the contract details for this sale. So if I'm dealing with a property that has, in Colorado, we see a little bit more of this, but it may vary for your area, but we do have septic systems and well systems depending on what part of Colorado you're in. And if that's the case, I have a certain process that I need to do to make sure that I'm getting all of that septic information to the right party members. So I need to make sure that if I have a septic on site, I can come in and say, I'm going to require a septic due date to be filled out. And then in my form triggers, I'm going to use this same condition to pull in my tasks and documents. So to build a form condition, all you do is come up to the top left, select add condition here, and it's going to give you a conditional type. For form conditions, it is just your fields that we can base this off of. So we would select property field in our dropdown, and then we can choose which field this condition is going to be using. Don't think we have one for solar, so let's do that. So this one is probably going to become more common as we move forward. But if there is solar on site, I may want to have a condition here that says, if this is owned solar, so there's not a lease on it, I'm going to pull in this additional field. But as you can see there, I had another choice option in that drop down. And so I would likely want to build another condition for the other option as well. So if there's solar on site and I say, yes, it's leased, I also want to build a condition around that. Once your conditions are here, we then need to build in an action. So what am I telling myself to do as I'm completing this intake form if these conditions are met? Now, I don't think I have the appropriate date field for this, but I likely would build in a field for when I need to complete my solar process.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that we have a lot of deadlines in contracts for this quite yet, but we could put in additional questions, for example, to see maybe who is the leasing person for a leased solar unit. It really kind of depends on what information you guys need to capture, again, when you're filling out this intake form. So fields are custom, whichever you need to choose and prompt for here. Let's hypothetically say I need to pull in this field. I can also require this field to be filled out on the intake form as well. So if checkbox is red, it's required. If it's not red, it is not required. It will just be available for that user to complete. Otherwise, we can also require contact roles if our conditions are met as well. So with contact roles, probably a better example would be for a referral. If I say, yes, this is an agent referral or a company referral, I could put in a requirement for my user to enter in the referral agent if I say yes to that, and I can even require it. For me, as a TC, I'd actually rather require a document because that shows me all of my referral details. So you also have the option to come in and conditionally require documents in your intake form. So with this, I also have the required option as well. So that way, if they say, yes, there's a referral, I know I can capture that referral agreement right off the bat before I even start processing my transaction. Next is going to be that internal instructions. So this is just going to be a prompt that the user sees when they're approving that intake form. Did you have something else, Sam?
I do. So when we're looking at that dynamically adding document uploader, I think that this kind of filters back into Sarah's question of like, I have file roles associated. When Jana entered in that agreement or referral agreement, right? And she didn't put on the file role. The reason she didn't put on the file role is because she knows that we need this referral agreement, upload this, but I'm going to file it away later. If you have it set up in your account where you're asking for the referral agreement and you're also asking for the file role, this is typically helpful if you do not have a document template that already has the file role set up for each one of those placeholders. So what I usually suggest is when you're doing out your intake form, you have to think, am I using the document templates? Am I not using the document templates? Obviously, we push you use your document templates because you're going to have a lot of documents, but in some cases you might not need it. You might not need anything but that referral agreement. Maybe there's no other documents that you need that would be for that specific folder. So you can add in that file role if you would like to. It just, again, it kind of depends on your process. Typically, I find people, they're getting those documents as they go through the transaction. They don't get them right away. So they usually use their document templates to show, do we have it? Do we not have it? Does it need to get attached? Does it not need to get attached to the different emails or communication that you guys do? So that's the only thing I have for that. Yeah.
One thing, you do have drag and drop here as well. So just keep that in mind if you guys need to organize on the screen. You can't recreate your conditions once they're built. So if you didn't build the conditions the way that you want them to, it is going to be a trash can icon on that. So just keep that in mind. Oh, yeah.
One other thing. So you see how it says leased solar and owned solar? If at any point that answer changes and you update that answer from leased solar to, I don't know, leased solar panel, it will update the answer here as well. So if you're just updating the verbiage to make sure, because your agent said, I don't know what leased solar means. What do you mean by that? And you're like, what's the least solar panel, the big black thing they have in the front of yard or their backyard or on their house. I just want you guys to know that when you update that answer, it does update it here. So you don't have to worry about, oh, when I update the field answer for solar, which is where Jan is taking us right now, is it going to actually, show up in my field? So if here, go ahead, type it in, put in a panel if you want, and we could just remove it later, I guess. I want you guys to see this because I know a lot of people have gone and updated their answers to their fields, which is perfect. But then they're like, wait, is it going to filter into my conditions, or do I have to, redo that condition? What you're going to see here is it does update that. So you see here now it says owned solar panel. So if you do need to update the answers, feel free to. Just keep in mind, if we change that answer from yes to no or no to yes, that's when things can get a little crazy. So we have some waived ones. Yeah.
Let's kind of go through and talk about that. Actually, it's a really good point there.
Yeah.
The information we're showing you guys is actually a part of what we call our pre-built accounts. We do offer this for free for users that are just getting started. And we built it. We've also revamped it already. Yeah. And one of the revamps we did was kind of neutralizing these questions here for our contract. So it's a little bit easier because not everyone liked to use waived appraisal or waived inspection. So this account doesn't reflect those changes per se, but if that's the case for you, where maybe instead of waived appraisal contingency, you want to see, will there be an appraisal? This is changing. Oh, that's not what I wanted.
It didn't copy.
Still not. Oops. That real quick. So by changing that from waived appraisal contingency, that kind of logic means that if I waived this, that means I'm not going to deal with an appraisal process. If I have not waived this, I will be dealing with that appraisal process. So right now, the the options in my field are going to be the same. Updating my field label, my merge field does not change the options in choice fields. So if I change this from more of that no, yes, if I say no, pull in my processes, if I say yes, don't, to this type of question where if I say yes, there will be an appraisal, I want those tasks, documents, etc. to come in. Instead of creating new questions here or dragging and dropping the order, and also from having to come in and update all of your condition logic throughout your account, instead just rename those. So instead of dealing with a positive or negative, just flip-flop it. So if previously my no was going to pull in my processes and now I need that to be a yes, just come in here and swap that out. And what this will allow you to do, don't forget to hit your update. Of course it did. Oh, that's
sometimes it gets a little mad because it says we already have a yes. So I usually say add in a dash, add in a one, add in
that was my bad.
Yep. Add in some sort of something to sort of alter the name or the language of it. That way, no one. And you can put that as no. I'm gonna update. And then we can update that to yes. So it's just a matter of playing with the system a little bit because the system knows what answers you're putting in there. So when you put in yes, and then you try to type in yes again, it's like, we already have yes. You don't need another yes. So just a little bit of things that you can do to update that. But now when Jana updates that field label to will there be an appraisal, and she's updated the answer to now yes to no, she swapped those questions. If we look at that field, will there be an appraisal? I think it's like the fifth one down.
Are you wanting in the field editor or in the intake?
Oh, in the intake form, Yeah, so they can see the condition. There you go. So you can see now it's updated that question and it's updated that answer. This is why I say don't be scared of updating those fields. Don't be scared of changing them out. Don't be scared of getting a little crazy with it and making some really, really fun changes with your questions. Your intake questions are meant to be changed. They're meant to be altered.
Yeah. So with that, if you guys have any questions on form conditions, definitely reach out, let us know. This does take some time to really sit down and think through your processes and how you want your system to work. So if you haven't spent some time building out your tasks and building out your document templates, it's not going to be a worthwhile investment for you to go in and build all the conditions that are going to power those templates yet if you don't know what that looks like. So definitely take some time and build out the actual processes for your day-to-day. And once you have that in place, it doesn't have to be perfect, but then come over to your intake forms, and these form conditions are going to make a lot more sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Same with your form triggers. So that's kind of the main piece we'll spend a chunk of time on. Again, if you guys have questions, please feel free to post those in Q&A. But with form triggers, we see a lot of questions come back to here. And the reason for that is this is how everything gets applied to your property after the intake form is filled out. So a couple of things to keep in mind here to kick things off. When I am adding a new trigger, the first thing I need to sit down and really think about is, does this information need to get applied when the form is submitted or when I'm done approving that form? So the main thing that we keep in mind is I want my fields on my property as soon as that form is submitted. And the reason for that is those fields are then going to be used in the conditions for all of our triggers below. So if I am going to be choosing a trigger function for add or remove field section, add or remove field, I do want that to be on the form submitted side. The other thing that we see a lot of is people starting out by adding in all fields to their property record and then creating triggers to remove those field sections. Our default is try and add versus remove as much as possible. Yes, you can do it, but I'm mostly going to use those remove prompts for individual items on a case-by-case basis. I don't want to remove everything in my conditions by default. So
yeah, deal in positives, not in negatives.
Yeah. Next thing to look at is applied template. This one, we do get some good questions on as well of when do I need to use an intake form trigger template. It's a long sentence. But that is going to be under your trigger templates function, which is on, I believe, our scale plan up, or is that on?
I believe the trigger templates, the intake form trigger templates are on the premium add-on.
Okay.
So if you have the $99 additional, that's when it's going to be on.
Yep. The main reason I would use a intake form templates like that is if I want to have the same triggers in multiple intake forms, and I don't want to add in 5 triggers for 3 different intake forms, I could just build a template for that and then apply my template, saving me some time. So that's going to be where those are beneficial, is just not having to build out individual triggers if I know I need to use them in multiple different forms.
Yeah. I definitely see you guys doing this a lot with when you have multiple states too. That's usually when I see, Yeah.
No, that's a good point. Next thing is just refresh triggers. If you need to refresh your page, it is best to do that with the prompts that you see, just because if you hit your browser refresh, it will take you back to your dashboard. The other thing, and I don't know that we see enough of this, so highly, highly recommend you guys using your sort triggers function. When we click on this, it's going to show us all of our triggers, and it's going to actually color code those. So if it's going to be applied on the agent submitted side, it's showing in green. If it's applied on the internal approval side, it's going to show in peach. So this is where all of our fields are applied on that agent submitted side. You can see that they're all in order. I don't have any templates being applied until all of my fields are already on my property. The next thing with this, we also do see this vary a bit, is I have my details text box showing here in my sort triggers function. If I did not include those details, so if I expand a trigger here, let's say I just delete this, I'm not going to have anything show. And so one thing that we do see oftentimes is you're building up a lot of great triggers, but when we go to sort, we have no idea what this trigger does at quick glance. So for the sake of just efficiency and being able to know and reorganize your triggers, pop in a quick little detail here to what does this trigger actually do. As long as you have those details in there, when you're in your sort triggers on the intake, and also when you're on the front end on your properties, you'll have the ability to easily sort those. This should be just a drag and drop function as well. Next thing, kind of taking a look at, we had some good questions come up with this on a couple of calls actually, of I want to send out a notification to my team when I get a new file. And so how do I do that in my intake form? So we do have the option to send an email, to send a text directly through my intake form. Now, these are great for those notifications that go out from the system as soon as our action is met. Mm-hmm. But there's a couple of things to keep in mind, especially for form submitted emails, text messages. Let's just build one really quickly. It does give us this message here, and this is what we're going to touch on of just with these types of triggers. I don't have a guarantee that the fields for my merge field smart blocks will be in the system or on my property yet before this goes out. So if I use a bunch of merge fields in this email, they may not populate one, but it also can kind of throw the system off because it's trying really hard to do its job. It really wants to send this email, but it doesn't have the information that it needs. So most oftentimes, if I need to have an email or a text message go out from this property as soon as this intake form is submitted, the best thing that I like to do is use my property address merge field, or even keep it a little bit simpler and say new, what's wrong? So that way this can actually notify that we have a new contract. And by default, I know I can hop into my account and see those details. Mm-hmm. With this, I can designate the email address that this goes to, but I'm not going to be able to choose a contact role because, again, I may not have those contact roles on my property just yet. So best option here is to type in a direct email address. So this is going to be kind of like a non-conditional. It's going to the same person every time. It's just going to be a very quick notification that we have this new file. If I want to do more, that's where I can change this to approved internally, is when I want this email to go out. By changing that option here, I can come back into my email and I'm going to see a slightly different editor. Now I can actually designate the contact roles that this message would go to, and I'll have the option to include those merge fields and or smart blocks. Now, again, this is a notification type email. If you're trying to use this for your intro emails, we'd actually recommend that you do that with task triggers. Majority of the time, if you're getting started, if you're on our highest plan, you can use your property triggers for that as well. Any additional points there, Hannah?
No, I think you covered it. The only thing is if you do change it, again, like Jana said, to form is approved internally, we would want to make sure to sort that trigger and put it in the right area, because if right now we look, the peach is at the top. We want to make sure when we're sorting our triggers, they like to fire off in order of how they're set up. So if you have an email that is approved at the top, and then you have all of your fields that are supposed to go out first, right? Once they're submitted, sometimes the intake form can take longer. If you put it in order of what it would truly fire off as in all of the submitted stuff needs to come in first, and then we need whatever's improved afterwards, it runs a lot smoother. And then you're not having to worry about those delays in sort of like not only the approval process, but also when the form gets submitted to you guys.
Yeah, that's good. Another thing that we're seeing with your triggers is kind of refinement with your guys' accounts. So typically when we're getting people onboarded in the system, we like to say, let's focus on the core parts of your process. Yes, eventually we highly recommend and encourage you guys to build all of the pieces of your process in here. But if it's something that you're doing 5% of the time on your deals and you still haven't started using the system, it's okay for it not to be 100% or 110%. If you can get to that 80% mark, even that 75% mark where your core processes are being added in here,
Mhm.
that is a great place to be. You will, and we do expect you guys to continue to edit and add in information to your account as you go. So one thing that we do see a bit in implementation is when users are in refinement, they may go back and change their fields. And like Hannah was saying earlier, it's not a bad thing. We do encourage you guys to make sure that these fields work for you and your business. So again, it's okay to have those changes into your account. Just keep in mind, most oftentimes your fields that you use power most of your system. So see if we can find a good example. I actually was working with someone where they had their state contract change recently. And based on how that state contract changed, they actually had a slightly different process to do. And so one thing that they found is they had to add in some additional fields, which they were going to use moving forward to track this change in their business. And so they went through, updated and added in those fields. It looked great, put in the appropriate field group, all of that. Updated the intake form to ask for those fields, but we did miss a spot with our trigger conditions and also updating those there. So one thing to kind of keep in mind is as I look at these conditions in my form triggers, these are very similar, if not the same condition logic that I used in my form conditions as well. And it's also the specific questions that I'm requiring to be answered on my intake form every time. So I think the main common thing we see is adding in additional questions and then also additionally required fields. So if this field is going to pull out specific processes, make sure that as you add it into your field editor, come in and make sure we're requiring and asking that on our fields tab if it's going to be asked every single time. If it's a conditional thing, again, go in, ask for it on your form conditions tab. Once you update it there, don't forget to come in and update it in your form triggers. So that's where also having those details can be really helpful because I can come in and say, I just need to update my process for my home inspection. So I'm going to find home inspection here. I also see a home inspection down here. So I can expand those trigger options, scroll down, and then I can find my conditions and update those. Now, one thing to also note is I can't change existing conditions. Instead, I would just add new and I can remove my old one. So that's something that's come up a little bit more lately. I do think we're seeing some slight changes with contracts. Just every year, states like to update those. So just kind of keep in mind, if your process is changing, we also want to make sure it's reflecting that change in your account.
Yeah. I think a great example that Jana had used earlier was that we added in that on-site, that solar on-site. Is there solar? But we didn't add the question into the field editor or into the fields. So if Jana goes to the fields and she goes to the intake question, we want to ask that question. So if she selects, again, green before red to bring that field on, have it come in. Now we're asking that question. Let's say when you say there is a owned solar, you need to find out, okay, when was the solar last maintained? So that you can include that in your solar disclosure. And then are you going to have it serviced before someone purchase it? And then who is the person that would do it? So that adds in a couple more fields. If we wanted those fields on there, we would not only want to add them to the form conditions, but we would also want to make sure we went to the form triggers and said, if there's a solar on site, these are the field sections that we need to bring in. Now, Janice showed us different fields, individual fields that we can bring on. There's also the ability to bring on field sections. I've always suggested you guys bring in your field sections. It's better to have all of the fields come in and need 5 of them instead of all 6 of them than to add in one field. And then I added in another field and then add in another field. It's easier to do it with the field sections. Make sure that field section feels really, really good and it matches that process that you need. I think the other thing, if you wanted to show it, Jana, if you use, I think PC or Mac, either one should work. If you do Command F or Control F on this screen, and type in appraisal. I think that would be a good one since you made an update to that one. As Jana started to type that in, it likes to highlight on the page. This is something you can use on Firefox, on Chrome, on any other web page. But I think that this is a really important tool because if you change that, you know how we change that field for appraisal, it does like to change it for here too. So we have the correct logic now also filtering into your triggers. So we see here, this is bringing in these two specific fields. If Jana uses that arrow and continues to go down for that one right there, it'll continue to take us down the page and go, there's the field section, there's the template with it. So it just kind of helps you. If you want to scroll, that's totally fine. I just like this because for me, it pops. And when you have so many triggers, sometimes you need something that's like, I'm here. don't scroll over me. So this is another thing.
I use this. So I would be lost without my find function.
Definitely.
Yeah, and you actually brought up a really good point there. We use a lot more individual field triggers in our pre-built account than we see in some other profiles. And it's because we've actually chose to, we really got to clean up our field groups, but we chose to have a critical deadlines field section. So instead of putting in our, date field, days fields for home inspection in our inspection field section, it's very wordy, we chose to keep it all up top. So that way all of those deadlines are top of mind. You can easily see them grouped together. Now this is preference. So you guys may not want to do this. If you want to have your specific due dates or date fields in the actual field section for the rest of that topic, feel free to do so. The only reason we really liked it this way is, again, just kind of keeping those top of mind. So because they are in their separate field section and we don't always need these every single time, that's where we did go in and build out those individual field triggers here. So that way we get that control to say, I only want to pull in these deadlines if there's going to be an appraisal on the property or inspection, etc.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, the rest have been pulled in through field sections. The other nice part with that too is you don't have to then go in and add in additional form triggers for any additional fields that you add in later on in life. As long as you're adding it into field sections that we know are going to be pulled into your property, if we say, yes, there's an HOA, then because you've used those field sections in your triggers, we know it's going to be pulled in this next time. So it's also really helpful as you are growing in your account. That way it's less updates as long as we put them into those specific field sections here.
Another reason we use the critical deadlines for anyone who does have that pre-built account is that when you're an agent and you're looking at the properties, you can obviously give them vision into any details for the properties. But if you just want them to see the timeline, just the dates, you can technically say, we just want them to see the critical deadlines and give them access to it. So in their portal, they just see those critical deadlines at the top.
And add them to the first one. Yeah, the bad examples, but
no worries.
It looks like we are about time. I know it's been a bit of a different Wednesday workshop this week. We didn't have as many questions today, so definitely feel free to come back this next week, post those questions here so that way we can dive into some topics that you guys are running into yourself. But definitely. We hope this has been helpful, just kind of going through some of the best practices that we really encourage our users to implement when they're working with us, and also just some things that we're seeing in support. So hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks for coming, and we'll see you next Wednesday.
See you guys then. Oh, we do?
Oh, nope, I have not a question, but thanks, Miriam.
Yeah,
good luck. You got this. Let us know how we can help out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, guys.